Hey everyone, today we're tackling the Age of Industrialization, which is Chapter 4 from your Class 10 NCERT textbook. And listen, this isn't just some old history lesson. It's really the story of how our modern world got built, forged in the fires of factories and mills. It's a story that played out very, very differently in Britain versus in India.
Now, if you're getting ready for your board exams, or maybe you're even a UPSD aspirant, you know this chapter is a big deal. It's absolutely crucial. So our goal here is simple. We're going to break down all the key concepts, make them really easy to understand, and even easier to remember for your exams. All right, so here's a game plan. We'll kick things off with the big dream of a new machine age. Then we're going to land in Britain, which was pretty much the world's first industrial workshop. After that, we'll see how all this change affected regular workers' lives. And then we pivot to colonial India. You'll see this chapter is really a tale of two completely different industrial revolutions. So, what was the brand image of this new industrial age? How was it sold to people? Let's look at two really powerful pictures from the early 1900s that were basically ads for this new dream of progress. Okay, check this out. On the left, from a music book cover in 1900, you have the dawn of the century. It's this angel of progress, literally flying into the future on a wheel with wings, with all these symbols of technology like trains and factories behind her. Then, on the right, you have the two magicians. You've got Aladdin, who stands for the old, magical East, and he's being totally overshadowed by the modern mechanic who's building the modern world. The message, especially coming from the West, was loud and clear: machines are the future. But was that the whole story? Was it really that simple? Let's dig a little deeper. Get on the ground in Britain, the very first industrial nation, and see what was really going on before those giant factory smokestacks started to dominate the skyline. Okay, here's a term you absolutely need to know for your exams: proto-industrialisation. Just think of it as the pre-factory phase. There was a ton of production happening for a global market, but it wasn't in big, centralized factories. It was this huge, decentralized system that was run by merchants in the towns, but the actual work, that was being done in people's homes out in the countryside. And this system created this amazing complex web that connected the towns and the countryside. A merchant clothier in a town would kick things off, buying wool. Then he'd send it out to a whole chain of rural families. First to the spinners to make yarn, then off to the weavers, then to people called fullers who treated the cloth, and finally to the dyers. This whole production line, which could involve hundreds of people for just one merchant, would all end up in London, where the final product was finished and prepped for export. Now, the very first factories did start popping up in the 1730s, but the real symbol of this new age wasn't iron or steel. It was cotton. Richard Arkwright's cotton mill, well, that was a game changer. For the first time, all those expensive new machines and every single step of production could be brought together under one roof, with a manager supervising everything. This was a completely new way of working. And the growth that followed was just explosive. Get this. In 1760, Britain was importing about 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton. Just a little over 20 years later, in 1787, that number had leaped to 22 million pounds. It was this massive hunger for cotton that really fueled that first wave of industrialization. But, and this is super important to remember, it's a major correction to the old myth. This change did not happen overnight. It wasn't some sudden revolution. These new industries didn't just wipe out the old ones. The new tech was expensive, it broke down a lot. Even the famous steam engine took a very long time to catch on. In fact, historians now agree that the typical worker in the mid-1800s wasn't a machine operator in a factory. They were a traditional craftsperson still working by hand. Okay, so what did this new machine age actually feel like for the people on the ground? The workers in the factories and the workshops of Britain. So here's the bottom line, economically speaking. Victorian Britain had a massive surplus of workers. People were pouring into the cities from the countryside, all of them desperate for a job. And with so many people available, factory owners could keep wages ridiculously low. It led to a pretty simple calculation for industrialists. Why would I spend a ton of money on an expensive, unreliable machine when I can hire cheap human labor instead? And life for these workers was just brutal. This quote here from a man named Will Thorne, who had walked all the way to London looking for a job, really gives you a sense of that struggle. He remembers sleeping outside after his money ran out completely. And his story was the story of thousands who came to the cities dreaming of a better life, only to find themselves homeless, waiting for weeks or months for any kind of work at all. This tension between workers and machines can be perfectly summed up by one invention, the spinning jenny. James Hargreaves created it in 1764, and from a production standpoint, it was a miracle. A single worker could now spin a bunch of threads at once, which massively sped up the whole process.
But if you were a hand spinner, especially one of the many women whose entire income depended on that work, the spinning jenny wasn't a miracle. It was a direct threat to your survival. The fear of being replaced by a machine was so real that it led to actual violence. There were reports of workers, particularly women, physically attacking these new machines.
Now, while Britain was busy building its industrial empire, that whole process was having a totally different and often devastating effect on the other side of the world. So now we turn to India, where the story of this age isn't one of factories rising, but of traditional industries collapsing under the weight of colonial rule. You see, before the British arrived, India was a global powerhouse in textiles. There was this vibrant trade network run by Indian merchants, operating out of classic ports like Surat and Hooghly. But as the East India Company got more and more powerful, that old world just crumbled. Power and all the profits shifted to new colonial ports like Bombay and Calcutta, which were all controlled by European companies. The old Indian trading families were ruined. And to really lock down this new system, the East India Company brought in a new kind of agent, the Gomastha. These were paid servants sent into villages to directly manage the weavers. Their job was to cut out the old Indian merchants, force weavers into contracts by giving them loans they couldn't refuse, and then make sure production targets were met, often by using threats. And since they were outsiders, they had no local ties and often clashed with the villagers. The effect on Indian weavers was catastrophic. I mean, this chart says it all. In 1811, Indian textiles made up a third of all of India's exports. By 1850, after years of the Indian market being flooded with cheap, machine-made cloth from Manchester, that share had plummeted to just 3%. India went from being a world-class exporter of cloth to just being a market for British goods. But that is not where the story ends, because out of the ashes of that traditional craft economy, a new kind of Indian industry started to rise up in the late 19th century, this time led by a new generation of Indian entrepreneurs. And here are some key dates you should definitely jot down. The first Indian-owned cotton mill opened in Bombay in 1854. A jute mill was right behind it in Bengal in 1855. Then, in the 1860s and 70s, you see mills popping up in Kanpur and Madras. This was the time when pioneering industrialists like Jamsetji Tata began to lay the groundwork for modern Indian industry. And then came a massive turning point, the First World War. All of a sudden, British mills were totally focused on making stuff for the war effort, which meant imports from Manchester into India basically stopped. This created a golden opportunity. Indian mills now had this huge captive market right at home. They were even asked by the colonial government to make war supplies like jute bags and army uniforms. The war was, in a strange way, a massive boom for Indian industry. And what's so interesting is that this rebirth wasn't just about giant factories. The small-scale handloom weavers, they also found ways to survive and even to grow. How? By adopting small, smart pieces of new technology. A perfect example is the fly shuttle. It was a simple mechanical device that let a weaver work much, much faster. This small innovation helped them ramp up productivity and actually compete with the big mills. So, with all these new factory-made goods hitting the market, both from Britain and from India, a new problem came up. How do you convince people to buy your stuff instead of the other guys? And this brings us to our last piece of the puzzle, the birth of modern advertising. And the marketing tactics were like night and day. British companies would stamp their cloth with "Made in Manchester," which they pushed as a sign of quality. They also did something really clever. They put images of Indian gods and goddesses on their labels and calendars, trying to make their foreign products feel familiar, even divinely approved. Indian manufacturers, though, they played a totally different game. They tapped right into the growing spirit of nationalism. Their ads had a simple, powerful Swadeshi message. If you love your country, you'll buy Indian products. And that brings us right back to where we started. After seeing this whole story, the slow, painful birth of industry in Britain, and the parallel story of destruction and nationalist rebirth in India, we can look at those pictures of progress in a totally new way. That dawn of the century, well, it clearly wasn't dawning for everyone in the same way. Which makes us ask the single most important question of this whole chapter. When we talk about progress, we always have to ask, progress for who?